Hello there guys, it's Joey. So this video is going to be a little bit of a ramble, I think. I wanted to talk about the goddess Badb and Moth totem energy and show a couple of products which were requested, given this energy of a correlation between the totem of Moth and the goddess Badb. So the items that we'll show later are a request, but I wanted to sort of have a little ramble, have a little talk about this subject because it's actually come up in a couple of questions lately about sort of totem animal work and then the goddess Morrigan, or in this case the goddess Badb, who some decide is a completely separate goddess, and then some feel that she is an aspect of the Morrigan. One of her aspects, mainly the crone aspect, and then talk a little bit about Badb and death energies and moth energies, and I told you it's going to be a bit of a ramble. Now, because originally I have a video up talking about how I felt there was a correlation between moth energy and the goddess Badb, and that video I will try to remember to link down below, so you can go check that out, and that has a much more in-depth analysis of why I feel that moth energy was quite key to working with Badb. Particularly, I think that was actually around the same time of year, so for me in the northern hemisphere heading towards Samhain, we're going deep into those death energies, we're going towards the real meaty chunk of the dark half of the year. It's my favourite time of year, it's most people's favourite time of year, I imagine. Not everybody, some people will be like no, but I'm like yes. Yes, more dark goddess energy, please. So I've had a number of questions talking about how do you know whether or not a particular totem or a particular animal is coming to you, and whether or not this is to do with the goddess Morrigan or not. Perhaps you've already engaged on a path where the Morrigan has spoken to you and you've already dedicated, you're already opening yourself up to those experiences, and suddenly you have this animal surrounding you all the time, and it's not traditional. So, and then there's the other side of it where people are like, well, I've seen something be suggested as part of something to do with the Morrigan and it really doesn't sit with me, or I've been told that this has nothing to do with the Morrigan, but this is speaking to me on my level as part of my path, help, or what do you think, that sort of thing. And this is how I perceive it. So I, as I have said, have taken on a more evolutionary perspective of how I personally view the goddess Morrigan and gods and goddesses in general. I don't believe in a static analysis of any god or goddess, whereas I believe mythos is incredibly important, incredibly useful, and absolutely should be part and parcel of your investigations, your in-depth relationship with any particular god or goddess. I don't feel that that's where they began and ended. I think that they have evolved along with humanity and alongside humanity, and that is one of the big draws of paganism for a lot of people, in that it's not just dogmatically the way it was X amount of years ago and doesn't take into account human evolution, human change, the change in culture, the change in how we view different elements and aspects of things which our ancestors would have viewed completely differently, and it's just, you know, history versus now as far as I'm concerned, and I don't feel that gods and goddesses would be static at all. I just don't feel that way about it, and I've talked about this in pop culture references. I know there are some people who work very in depth with the idea of pop culture and bringing sort of the modern into their practice, and some people refuse it outright and stick to simply what the ancient Celts did. So I understand from an animal aspect people's kind of fears of, well, if you're bringing in certain animals that have absolutely nothing to do with, and this kind of works with any element that people bring into the goddess that has absolutely nothing to do with the energy and the tone and sort of being respectful towards a particular god or goddess, and if you bring in something which really doesn't make any form of sense to the goddess, So let's use an example. I was asked recently via email about somebody who was looking at different animals, and they're feeling birds, sorry, and it was to do with a particular product, but of a smudge fan, basically, they were getting from somewhere else. And you know, the suggested feathers for filler feathers had been duck, peacock and hen and pheasant, I think, and they didn't feel right about any of these birds being brought into a smudge fan for the goddess Morrigan. And as far as they were aware, there was nothing to do with in the myth, and as far as I'm aware, there's nothing in the myth to even suggest, you know, that any birds other than crows, ravens and the corvid family have a direct correlation with the goddess Morrigan. And for me, I would probably say that those particular birds for me wouldn't resonate with the tone, the inclination of the goddess Morrigan, because as much as I love ducks, right? I love ducks. I think they're the most amazing, funny, I can't say clown because we're having all kinds of creepy clowns right now, but you know, humorous birds that there are. I think they are naughty. I love their feet. I love their waddly little feet, how they walk. I think that's, you know, they're just hilarious. And just while I'm on the subject, there's a load of them on this little lake thing nearby where I live, and every time you walk past, you hear that they're like laughing at people. It's just crazy. Anyway, that's completely by the by. But I wouldn't say that there's any energy that correlates between sort of working with an animal spirit, an animal energy, an animal totem of something like a duck with the goddess Morrigan. Because you've got goddess Morrigan, you've got quite warlike, quite strong, quite independent, you know, and ducks, you know, it doesn't slot into being. However, I think there is something to be said for animals which you are having a deep personal connection with, and probably were around at the time of the Celts as well, you know, that had some significance to the Celts, or were known to the Celts, or were around, and that's why I feel that creatures such as moths in this example, and then I've talked about wasps, which also have a very warrior-like energy to them, and I know a guy who is being surrounded by praying mantis. Now, praying mantis may or may not have had anything to do with Gaulish Celts. I'm not sure. Possibly not. It's very difficult to know. I'm not a historian of insects, so I couldn't tell you. But they are quite warlike in the whole biting off heads and the sort of strong female energy associated with the praying mantis. So you can kind of see a correlation there, you know, you can kind of see messages perhaps coming through the goddess in terms of particular insects or particular animals that the Celts may have been aware of and may have engaged with, and perhaps are present in other myths. Is a good sort of confirmation, if you like, in looking into other totem animals to do with correlating them to a particular goddess and working them into your path. So that having been said, I've basically presented you with two contradictory even arguments that you should be able to embrace in terms of an evolutionary sense, what the goddess may be telling you, any god or goddess may be telling you through signs. And there's a really good article from Joanna DeVoe that I shared on the Starry Eyed Facebook page, which was making sure that you are recognising what synchronicity is, aka messages from the divine, from the universe, and things that are speaking to you on a soul level versus kind of the ego seeing signs wherever one, just, you know, just to confirm your sort of ego rather than really listening to the divine. And I'll try and remember to link that below as well, because that's an amazing article. It's really good. So back on point. That can seem sort of contradictory, like, okay, you're saying that the goddess has evolved and you feel that she does evolve and we can embrace pop culture and things which are now present in modern day. You know, we've got representations from the media, from TV, from videos, from video games. You know, we have this plethora of artwork and a modern technology and modern understanding about the way the world works and modern values even. and you can see the goddess sort of shining through in different ways through that. But then you're saying that on the other hand, when it comes to particular animals and particular symbolism, which is really the point, rather we're kind of focusing on animal symbolism here, but you're saying that those don't quite, they don't kind of line up. But what if I really feel that they line up? And at that point I'm like, if you really feel they line up, then it's on you to kind of, you know, investigate why you think that is, to try and justify your argument within yourself, not to anybody else, because it doesn't really affect anybody else, but to really try and ground that in something which is tangible, you know, sort of a spiritual level, rather than it being just kind of an ego thing. Well, I think therefore it is, because I don't feel that that's the right way to approach spirituality on any level. But for me, it kind of has to have a sort of common sense thread, is probably the easiest way of starting it. So when I called the goddess Morrigan and I had my experience with a wasp, which is on another video, but basically I called for Mother and I needed her, and it was a very, very low moment, and I had a wasp come and do some crazy wasp stuff and then fly out again. And I'd been surrounded by wasps for a little while up to that point, and wasps have this very warrior-like energy. They have a sisterhood energy, and you know, doing more research into them, it was a very interesting warrior female archetype energy within wasp totem energy, and obviously they're quite hated by a lot of people, and they get a bad rep, and that was interesting correlation between goddesses such as Morrigan, who in the past have been demonized, both by, you know, the Christian monks that sort of demonized them into fae or demons, and then even in the modern sense, where people are trying to make out that, you know, she's bad and you have to be a badass to follow her, and you have to be mean and nasty to follow a dark goddess, and all that sort of stuff. Dark goddess without humour is how I see it. So basically, when you're looking at animal energy and working with animal energy into goddess energy, it's really about the instinct of youth primarily. So you have to look at whether or not you're kind of fitting pieces into place because you want pieces to fit into place and make sense, and you want the goddess to be speaking to you, and you want this, versus what synchronicity actually is, where, you know, there are things that you cannot ignore, that you cannot deny, that you feel on a gut, soul, bone level, that are adding up to messages for you. And that's how I felt about moth energy. And I can reconfirm that this time of year, working with these particular items that I was asked to create for Badb and moth energy, that there were a lot of moths around. And actually on completion, I went upstairs and there was a dead moth right in the center of the floor, just perfectly pristine, just huge. And I was sat looking at it. I thought for a minute, do I take that? Do I send it with the moth set? Is that a bit weird to send somebody a dead moth? It's probably a bit weird to send someone a dead moth. Probably don't want to do that. But I will take this moth and honor that this is the energy that I've been working with and looking at with regards to moth energy again. And the set itself, there's also a barrier powder which is separate, is called the Shroud of Badb. And that's how I feel about moth energy, that there is this shroud, and it kind of ties in with death shroud and the veil thinning, and then moth energy, and how I view sort of death goddess energy, and sort of it's kind of almost come about a lot more in sort of terms of physical manifestation of veils since working with the Norn energy and that kind of Scaldi energy, with being veiled and hidden, and the deeper mysteries and things being out of reach and out of touch. And there's been quite a lot of spook activity in this house since I actually got back from visiting a friend, and I mentioned about the music, and since then there's been quite a lot of non-negative spirit activity in this house, so death energies in this house, to the point yesterday where I heard a voice in my ear so clearly that I jumped out of my skin while I was on Skype with my sister. I was like, what the like that. So let's talk a little bit about moth energy in terms of a totem. I don't think I'll be going over old ground from the old video, but some notes that I made. Okay, so they are a nocturnal animal and they're drawn to the light, which I think most of us are aware. And that's often associated in terms of symbolism with dreams, shadows, otherworldliness, secret knowledge, and psychic awareness. So the mysteries, the unknowable, the shadow side, the shadow half. And let's see, the inner knowing. Okay, and I think that kind of sort of ties quite nicely with what we've been talking about, the kind of inner knowing of when something is a synchronicity, when something is a sign, when something matters and something is trying to grab our attention because there is a message there to better help, you know, take that into ourselves, try and make us a better person rather than confirming everything we are right now. And I think working with Badb energies in particular, she has this duality, and it's more than a duality because it's not just two sides of Badb. On one side you have the death crow, the screaming death crow, the wrathful screaming on the battlefield, and that it's very difficult to put into words how you know how we were talking about silence versus noise recently in videos, and I was talking about that when I'd been ill I'd felt very strongly about separating out what noise was in my life from silence, and being silent in order to distinguish between the noise and what mattered. That I think comes into the Badb element, that when she is overwhelmingly wrathful, the noise causes death, the screaming is the end of warriors, it's the end of things, it is the death call, the death cry, very much like the banshee scream in the Irish mythology. And then the other side of her is, to me, playful. I often see her show up as a maiden element. I often see her shift between crone element and maiden element. I often see her quite skeletal in appearance, very hell-like in some scenarios, but you know, still incredibly beautiful. And let's have a look at this in my notes again, one moment. Psychic awareness, flying high. A master of disguise can blend into the point of invisibility. Allure, suggestion, attraction. So the moth energy in that sense reminds me of the myth where the Morrigan appears as an old hag and asks, I think it's three young men? To sleep with her, and like I think it's 3, and oh, my brain's gone completely, and the 2 of them refuse and one agrees, and the one that agrees, and she turns into a beautiful maiden and blesses him for his sexual willingness. And I think Moth kind of has that drawing things to them, you know, how like they're drawn to the light, and there's kind of the strong female energy from moths that they can draw mates in from a long way. Their pheromones are very high and they draw their mates to them. And within that mythos of Morrigan, she definitely often sort of draws her mates to her and then challenges them. And there is definitely that element of moth energy when looking at crone goddess energies. There's quite a lot of myths, particularly in the Celtic mythos, about sleeping with older women who are actually beautiful maidens and they're actually goddesses, they're actually divine, and there are messages about not judging by physical appearance alone, because you're being tricked, you're being illusioned. There is shadow work going on, there is death energy going on. I was actually going to hold up the moth card from the Wild Unknowns Animal Oracle Spirit deck just as a point of reference. lunar moth. I don't have any images of the death head moth, and the death head moth being associated with memento mori, all men must die energies. So that is actually in the original Moth totem video, talking about how I felt that moths, particularly the death head moth, which has a physical skull on it, and that's kind of come through popular culture a little bit as well, interestingly enough, have come to be associated with death, with decay. And obviously, you know, it's interesting, isn't it? Like, I can think of many sort of movies or horror movies where moths show up as a symbol of death, and how, like, they used it in Crimson Peak, with all the moths being very symbolic of death, and how that was, you know, death in the house. I wonder if it's just literally, if there's anything about that. 1 minute. I'm going to have a look at if that movie... Is it literally, is it because they eat decaying? Yeah, see, the minute you look for, you know, you get lots of pictures of death head moths. They're so gorgeous. Moths are so beautiful. I think they get overshadowed by butterfly symbolism a lot, because obviously they're much more vibrant, but I think moths have this very gorgeous... You're really not going to load. Hang on. Let's have a look. Another example that I was going to pull from, that I can remember offhand, is that there is actually a symbol of a moth in the Memoirs of a Geisha book, and it's actually to do with rebirth, and she finds a moth cocooned. She finds a dead moth. I think she puts it in a tissue and puts it under the house, and then she finds it later, and it's perfectly cocooned into like a crystallized, almost dust form of a moth, and she touches it and it breaks. And she didn't realize it at the time, but it was a sign of her life was going to completely change. Black butterflies are a symbol of death. Yes. Why? Apparently there is no explanation as to why it's a symbol of death. I wanted to know why the movie... Come on. Come on. I'm guessing it's literally because it's so close to the veil, and because I was hoping that the movie would say why the moths are to do with death symbolism, but I know that they are, and I can't remember for the life of me if I found an original reason for that, other than the death's head moth, which obviously has a skull on its body, and possibly because they do tend to frequent, you know, musty, fusty places, so perhaps they are drawn to death and decay a little bit in terms of a scientific reason for the symbolism being there apparent. That's what I wanted. I wanted to know if there was a sort of a physical, scientific reason why they're associated with death a bit more. Someone will tell me, I'm sure. So there is this veil and the crossing of the veil energy to moths, and how they are shrouded and how they're to do with the moonlight, and then they're to do with the goddess, because the moon is often and most often associated with goddess energy. However, in the Celtic tradition you do have moon gods and sun goddesses. So as we approach the shroud, the veil thinning, Samhain, the mysteries, looking for the illumination, looking for the hidden, looking for the prophecy in our dreams, and so on and so forth. Moth totem energy usually does come up around for me now, and I do tend to see a lot more of them starting about now. And we have and do see them throughout the summer as well, but now they seem to be a little bit more present. Perhaps that's why we do associate with them with this time of the year. They become more active, they become more present. And I have in depth just sort of talked about why I felt already that the moth was associated with Badb, and I really didn't want to go over all of that information again that I've already done a video on, so I didn't really want to rehash that. But I did want to sort of talk a little bit about, you know, looking at why certain animals do appeal to us when looking at the relationship between goddess, such as Morrigan, such as Badb, and working through animal energy. And before I show the products at the end, there has been talk about, well, you shouldn't, like it's cultural, I've forgotten the word, appropriation, and to work with spirit animals and things. And I think there are some serious cases for cultural appropriation where there's, you know, a lack of respect, but when it's working on a deep spiritual level with animal energy that helps you to better understand the world around you, and helps you to meditate and take guided journeys, and do have places in Celtic lore and other pantheons where you can find energies of animals attached to legends and myths, then I think if something really speaks to you, then you have to listen to your intuition. Okay, so to finish off this particular video, we will show the items that were requested. The first thing that was requested was a pillar. I've got a moth, almost a moth wing here. We're gone with the grey. The grey works very nicely with moth energy. Not only do you get physical moths that are grey, but there is that in-between veil space, between life, between death, the mysteries lie. And then a smudge. I forgot how good this one was. Yeah, it's beautiful. So this is to honour the goddess Badb. It brings in moth energies as an undertow, but the smudge in particular is to do with honouring the goddess Badb. It's a crone energy, it's a mystery energy, it's deeply sexy as well though, because Badb is deeply sexy. And every time I say that, she's like, death is sexy, didn't you know? And okay, I should probably just recap why that is. Okay, so death within life is just the ending of that which no longer serves. Death in terms of the final is the big unknown, you know, there's nothing sexier than a big unknown mystery, then that's why people are obsessed with it. In terms of in life force, little deaths are a moment of release and vulnerability, such as le petit mot, which is the orgasm in French, which means the little death, and that's one of those moments of pure surrender to complete life force, and then is a little bit like a little death, because, you know, and it's the unknowable quantity, I think. It's the you better live while you're alive quality to it as well. That's very sexy, reminding us to live fully, because everybody dies. And this smudge creates that temple of Badb. It really truly does. It creates this Samhain based temple. It's very crone-like, it's very veiled, it's very shrouded, it's a lot of mystery, a lot of candlelight, a lot of shadows being cast, illusionary. It's about trying to understand the deep mysteries both within and without, above and so above, so below, as within, so without. And it really creates this old, archaic world where old meets modern and goddess meets the point between life and death and the brink, and trying to better understand where one came from and where one is going. And then we have the oil. Look at that. Look at that luminescence. Gorgeous, if I do say so myself. And then we have a Badb barrier powder. So I have a number of barrier powders on the store, and I really wanted to make one for Badb because I work with her energy quite a lot, and therefore creating a barrier powder to her in honour of her really worked for me. And that can work really well, particularly if you're having problems with spirits, like energy of spirits trying to screw about with your home. You want to create a barrier between the world of the living and the dead, or you know, that sort of thing. If it can work on a spiritual basis in terms of just protecting against magic and negative influences, because Badb is obviously the death crow and will put all that stuff to death. So it's a very, very strong dark goddess energy which can help in terms of a barrier powder. So I was going to include that with this video. When I was making the Moth set, she was kind of insistent on one of those as well. So there it is. So that is the end of my ramble about moth energy, animal totem energy, considering different animal totems with regards to goddess energy. It's a little bit of a rambly video because we did have the very specific video already about moth totem energy. So that's it for this particular video, and many blessings.